We're on? Okay. The most impactful part of the text, the Pratyabhijnahrydayam, and for me, the profundity of the whole system comes from the understanding that consciousness precedes and pervades the universe, the material world, and that consciousness that precedes and pervades the material world is a subjective consciousness, meaning it is self-aware. The consciousness which precedes and pervades has its own egoity, its own self-recognition. And that self-recognition is a living phenomenon. The text uses the word autonomous, meaning completely self-contained. But it also means a living autonomy. And the livingness is the dynamic nature. So in the tradition, all-pervading, pure self-awareness is referred to as Shiva, and its livingness, it's living constantly, recreating, constantly adapting nature is called Shakti and referred to as the goddess. And this autonomous, this living self-awareness through its own living process, its own respiratory process, generates a kind of intrinsic set of restrictions within itself, turbulence. But that turbulence isn't an absence of peace or an absence of the availability of the totality of its resources, the totality of its being. It's not like that. But the turbulence itself creates processes, gives rise to processes within ultimate being that creates this, what are referred to as contractions. It's not exactly a contraction, but more likely, maybe a subtle fragmentation, a multiplicity of things to pay attention to, which gives rise to a subtle fragmentation and focus, which then gives rise to and gives rise to and gives rise to. By the nature of the process of tattva, gives rise to a whole bunch of differentiated being that is never, was never, and will never be different than autonomous consciousness itself. Autonomous, some people would say divine consciousness. Divine because of its flavor, its quality. Its beauty, its intrinsic beauty. So this, and these beings, us, misunderstand themselves. Misunderstand because they identify with the physical nature, the contracted nature, the constrained nature, the limited nature of their existence. And identifying with the limited nature of their existence, in other words, wrapped in ancestral trauma. That ancestral trauma deludes us and distracts us from our capacity to recognize ourselves and our own innate beauty and our own innate capability, our innate potential, and causes us to adopt an attitude that is responsive to the constraints in our environment and not to the opportunities. That causes us to respond to the tensions in our environment and the traumas in our environment, and not to the beauty and the possibility and the bliss that is our innate inner environment and is also the intimate nature of the world around us. Tangled up in all of that, we misunderstand who we are, and misunderstanding who we are, we perpetuate the patterns of trauma and strain and tension in ourselves and in the field of our experience until we, become completely removed from the flow of creative energy within us and our lives, until our own vital energy, that livingness that has descended into, a form, that energy which has become constrained into form and structure, is completely compressed and slowly, is squeezed out of existence. We just become so tense that the flow of life within us and the flow of vital energy and then the circulation in our body is just like, till our bodies don't really breathe anymore and we get sick and die, or in some form or another. So, and all of this happens without ever, in any way, or any of the individual kind of dynamic processes that are expressed as living beings in this world, without any of them ever being separate from, disconnected, or in any way divorced from the innate and infinitely vast, unimaginable possibilities which are the very essence of their existence. So each of us is never separate from then our own divine nature. And even though having become contracted, we misunderstand the nature of our creative power. That power is never separated from us, it's never missing, it's always within us. We always have a connection to and access into it, should we choose to engage it. But for the most part, we become tangled up in our struggle with the world, which is a misidentification. Instead of perceiving ourselves and the world around us as an integrated respiratory process that is full of wonder and beauty and possibility, the mind that is at first pure subjectivity defends to the level of egoity and structure, and then the mind then becomes a threat recognition mechanism. And that threat recognition mechanism is in us so deeply, as a part of our existence that, there's nothing wrong with it, but there's never anything right with it. So, and I think I mentioned before that, it amazes me that first of all, I think the evolution of complex beings on this planet anyway, and probably throughout the entire universe, is really a response to a very simple circumstance, a very simple livingness that starts to condense. And as it condenses over and over again, the changes in the atmosphere in which it exists, causes adaptation upon adaptation upon adaptation upon adaptation. On Earth, we can see that the driver of evolution is climate change. Climate change. And we're getting a good dose of that, right here on Earth right now. But this is not a new thing. And, hysteria over it is pointless, because the climate of the Earth has changed and changed and changed and changed, over the period of existence 1 billion times. And this folding and refolding and refolding and reorganizing and readapting over and over and over again is what gives rise to these complicated sets of physiology and psychology, which are human beings and the minds that they have. There's a really interesting guy named Donald Hoffman who has a fascinating background that you can study for yourself if you want. But his basic premise is that we are seeing the world through our own VR set. That our perception of the world, the faculties through which we perceive the world are no different than a VR set, a virtual reality set, in which we are being presented in front of our senses with a set of data which is interpreted in a particular way. And so there may be no more reality to, the place that we are sitting than there is to a chair that we will observe and maybe even sit in a virtual reality context. We have such a limited ability to perceive the world we exist in. It may not be real in the slightest. And so, couple things here. One thing is the question of free will that I want to address. We don't know what the hell we're doing, and we have the illusion of free will, which causes us to engage the world in particular ways. And we have this whole subset of programming, my cookie nookie theory, that drives us to eat and reproduce. It is, sort of a generator of desire. And this notion of our will, our limited understanding of our will and our capacity, and the ways in which intrinsically our vital energy gets structured in the world and channeled in terms of its expression, over and over again, that's what builds ancestral trauma. That's the driver of ancestral trauma, and the folding and the refolding and the readaptation over and over again. And agency, or creative ability, the innate creative ability in all of us is ultimately profoundly unlimited by our circumstance. It is unlimited by the illusions that we live in. It is unlimited by the trauma that we are wrapped in that causes us to engage, to see things in the world that don't really exist there, to see the world in ways that it isn't, and to react to the world in ways that it isn't, that deny us. And this sort of our traumatic interaction with the world, trauma-based interaction with the world, denies us the opportunity. Because it's an endless feedback loop, it denies us the opportunity to appreciate our own highest nature and to live in the innate abundance, which is the very essence of what we are. And it denies us, our living in this, from our ancestral trauma, living in relationship to this imaginary world, which we don't see clearly in any case, but the ways in which we do see it, are structured by the trauma that we are blessed with from our ancestors. Sort of. It's constantly reinforced and constantly denying us the experience of a simple good feeling, which is the place from which all of our creative power and all of the depth of divine intelligence that we are blessed with resides. Everybody has the same access to, if you want to put it like this, information and abundance. Everybody has the same access. Doesn't mean it will all be expressed in the same way. It will not be, because each of us has a very unique set of adaptations that we have emerged from. But we have the same access to higher intelligence, and we have the same access to divine agency, meaning, divine agency, divine power, the power to do, the power to know, the power to be. We have the same access, each of us, to divine agency. And from that divine agency, we can begin to perceive, our world and the way we interact with it in endlessly new and abundant ways. So the text points out that we are all emanations of the mind of God, if you will, that the innate creative capacity of God is our birthright, and the innate beauty inherent in, the creative expression that is the manifestation of divine will is available to all. That's far out. That's far out. How do we get to that is the challenge. One is to understand. We get to that by really understanding that we're not in this world to make a nest and to feather that nest and to create a structure around ourselves that in some way, protects us from pain or any kind of discomfort. Most people go through life developing pain avoidance strategies. That's where most people on the planet live, in pain avoidance strategies. And you know what this absolutely guarantees? It absolutely guarantees that you're going to just live in pain. Pain avoidance strategy is 100% fail. And so, the next thing is that we have to take responsibility within ourselves for accepting the pain and engaging the process, and allowing it to teach us enough that we can stand up in the face of the pain, which is relentless for all of us on an everyday basis. We stand up to the pain and take it within ourselves as energy, and accepting that energy and embracing it and learning from it, we discover that we have a lot more power than we thought we had, and a lot more strength than we thought we had, and seeing the process through to its even temporary conclusion, we find that we have a lot more access to beauty than we imagined we had. Most people never even, especially young people, never grok, the importance or the availability of beauty in their lives. We want sex and Starbucks. That's what young people want, sex and Starbucks.
Wi-Fi.
Say again?
Wi-Fi.
Oh, Wi-Fi, yes, thank you. But Starbucks has Wi-Fi. Starbucks has Wi-Fi. It also has, and that's one level of stimulation. I was thinking Starbucks because you get caffeine and sugar, the two most important sources of stimulation in our world today. So I was saying, the first thing is we really need to understand something, which is we're not in this world to have a career. We're not even in this world to make money. We're not in this world to have a family. It may be that that's what we do, but that's not why we're here. We are in this world to grow. We are in this world to grow. Like every other living event in this world, we too are in this world to grow. And growing refers to growing our understanding of ourselves. Which becomes growing our capacity to establish an awareness of our deepest, innermost resource, the connection between our mind and the mind of God, and the mechanism by which that, understanding the mechanism by which that ultimate mind is expressed as, your mind and my mind. Because all mind, in its human form, or even in its plant form, and don't be mistaken, plants have mind. Plants are an emanation of mind, and mind is simply an organization of the information that is the essence of the cosmic process, expressed in this place and time through the veils of temperature and pressure. Each of us has a direct connection to the mind of God, and that's why meditation. But in beginning to commit ourselves to growing and coming into contact with that vital energy which is like in each of us, we discover a whole bunch of other stuff about ourselves. So, to experience our pain and recognize in the process of experiencing that pain that we really need to grow. And then having the good fortune somehow, for me, I had this, I came into the world, I could not find a place to settle in the world. I did not experience a pathway, through which I felt I could create for myself a life and shape, a world in a way that was in any sense satisfying or true. It just wasn't there for me. And fortunately, it's like I woke up one day in Bloomington, Indiana, as a college student and realized everything I'd ever been taught was a lie. Everything. What do you do with that? Well, fortunately, the one good thing that happened to me growing up a Catholic was, and experiencing the indoctrination of that organization. It entrained in me, a sense of that my purpose in this world was to know, love, and serve God. And that was enough for me, in those moments, my whole life at that point, my engagement in my social life, my cultural life, my political life, my economic life, all of that was involved in expressing myself to try to create a better world. And being involved in politics, you see that I had no problem with compromise, but the compromise that politics requires of us, because life on earth is a relentless compromise. And that's not a bad thing at all. You know, compromising, establishing and maintaining flow state, a shared flow state with others, requires that we let down our boundaries, that we release, you know, in some sense, the structure that has accumulated around us and begin to participate in a bigger flow with people. And that means that we're not going to, on the short term, you know, we're going to be exposed to uncertainty. We're not going to know what exactly the heck is going on. It's going to bring up all of the intrinsic fears that our ancestral traumas have embedded in us, that our mind is totally programmed to see. But moving forward in this process, you know, compromising in any case and being engaged in sharing our life with others for whatever purpose brings up the experience of, you know, corruption. It brings up, you know, it brings out people's own, you know, everybody's trauma gets more exposed, and in the process of that, some people will take advantage of other people. And that's pretty depressing when you're like this starry-eyed idealist. I refer to myself actually as delusionally optimistic and terminally naive. Probably still. But my delusions and my naivete reflect, you know, in the face of this perhaps completely unknowable world, you know, the place that I choose to stand in relationship to this world and everybody with whom I share it. So we're in this world to grow. And in dealing with all of this, like the challenge of my life, and when I was young, and the pain that I experienced of it, I had the extraordinary opportunity to engage something really unbelievably simple, which was a yoga class. It was a yoga class, and you know, they had to basically hog-tie me and drag me to yoga for about the first couple of months. Probably in the first 2 months I was doing it, I went half the time. And then something happened at one of those classes, and it's like something let go in me, and my body started to breathe, just. And that feeling changed everything for me. I don't even think I probably exactly recognized it the first time, but something about it pulled me back the next time, and then the next time, and then finally I did recognize it. And I did recognize in that process that, the love in my heart and the basic joy in my heart, which were the essence of my delusional optimism and my terminal naivete, was available to me, you know, independent of the enormous disappointment I was experiencing both in myself, because, you know, I was an outcast in my world. I was an outcast, you know, for a few reasons, but an outcast in my world. Irrespective of that, and, you know, the fact that the world was not responding to me in the way I had hoped it would, you know, I was able to live in that space of excitement and appreciation for living in a way that I had not experienced ever before. So there was a seed that cracked open inside me, simply because the structure of my tensions was reorganized by my encounter with such a simple thing as movement and breath and turning my mind within. Turning my mind within. Something I knew as a child that I had completely lost touch with because I was responding to the world around me. I was responding to the injustice and responding to the violence and responding to the lies that we were being told and fighting against something and working against something. And turning my mind inside and experiencing that sprouting of a seed in my heart and the sprouting of, the release of my joy from some political or ideology or some political effort or any worldly perspective whatsoever, totally changed everything for me. And then within a short time after that, I started having a really powerful experience because I was staying with that feeling. I came back to practice again and again and again. And at the time, I was working in Kroger's. That's a grocery store, the corporation now that owns Fred's. So I was working in Kroger's. I was working the night shift. I went to work at 10. I got off at 7 in the morning. And it was not even slightly fun, but I made $4.25 an hour, which in 1970 was a good wage. I was in a union, so I had some benefits. And I was so moved by the experience that I allowed myself to be fired so that I could spend my time practicing yoga, which I did for about 6 or 7 hours a day. And in that time of practicing 6 or 7 hours a day, I started to have these really big experiences for me, which informed me that I really needed a teacher. And I didn't even actually have to look for a teacher. I just started praying for a teacher, and suddenly teachers were there. I met Rudy. And that caused an explosion in my heart, which completely liberated my mind and my being from the notion that I needed a career, that I even needed a job. It separated my mind from a whole worldly trajectory that I had kind of, that all of us get engaged in. That all of us get engaged in. We are entrained with the notion that there is a worldly trajectory that we need to follow. And liberated from that worldly trajectory, it was easy for me to attend to my number one priority, which is growing my heart and growing my soul, growing the understanding of my purpose in this world, which was, and which I understood to be, the growing. You know, all of us, I mean, some of us have been practicing a long time, some of us not, but all of us need to understand that our true purpose in this world is to grow ourselves, to grow our hearts, to grow our minds, to grow our understanding. You know, to accomplish that growth, we need to dissolve our ancestral trauma and the tensions in our, physical, mental, and emotional bodies, hearts, and minds that accumulate, around those ancestral traumas, disrupting the flow of our own vital energy within our body, but also in the field of our experience. We're not here to, everybody requires some money, but we are not here to make money. We are here to grow the love in our hearts, and growing the love in our hearts, the tensions in our body dissolve, and the veils that cover up our minds, evaporate, and the ancestral trauma which, gives us, which we're all constantly in a dance with, interacting with, that ancestral trauma is relieved, and we can begin to sit in the space of divinity, which is our own essence, and endure in that divinity, becoming an ever more radiant and fine demonstration, expression of beauty, which is the very heart of the goddess, the very essence of the living respiratory process that the whole universe has appeared from. So, the text says, that we mistakenly take on the sense of limitation and limited agency. We take on a mistaken sense of our capacity. And we do that because my experience of it is we do that because we're afraid of pain. The thing about pain is the place where the work is. And we should never shy away from pain. Sometimes we have to mitigate our engagement with it because it can overwhelm us. That's okay. But we should never close our hearts and minds to any energy source that presents itself in our environment. Dissolving ancestral trauma is painful. There's a lot of layers to that. Some of it is just, you see how you've been and who you are in the limited sense, and that's kind of embarrassing. We don't want anybody to see that, and we don't want anybody to know that we're actually a human being. We'd like to, constantly create an image of ourselves, and we put energy into creating images of ourselves that protect us from the embarrassment of being seen by others. And, my own personal experience is that, if people see you, even if you're perfect, they're going to make up. Nobody ever wants to see you as you actually are. Nobody wants to see the beauty. Everybody, all of the radiance of this world gets structured into, the experience of radiance in this world gets structured into some kind of misunderstanding. So what I'm getting to is that's a pointless activity. Creating any kind of an image of ourselves is a waste of energy. Trying to protect ourselves from being seen by others is a waste of energy. Taking in all of the energy that is available to us in our field is part of the process of rising up to the level of universal awareness. So, understanding ourselves based on ancestral trauma is accepting the limitation of our capacity, and building a life that protects ourselves from pain enshrines that limited capacity and a limited view of the world and a limited view of ourselves. And it's only when we begin to understand that we are in this world to grow that in fact we awaken our own creative capacity. When we accept that growing is a painful process, we engage more fully our infinite capacity. And as we develop a methodology which is laid out in the Pratyabhijnahrydayam, we have the opportunity to dissolve all of our ancestral traumas, dissolve the tensions in our lives that those ancestral traumas have become, the structure for accumulation of. Ancestral trauma is a structure that allows for tension, which is short-term structure, and all of it is painful, which causes us to want to go hide under a rock. So, only then can we begin to come to some sense of the extraordinary power, the extraordinary and divine agency which is at the very core of our being and available to us through the process of spiritual practice or self-cultivation. Meditation, well, the text outlines a process by which let's see, I wanted to read a couple of things. Yes. The fire of Chitta, or universal awareness, when it descends to the lower stages, and the lower stages refers to individuated mind, ancestral trauma, and emotional and physical tension. When the fire of pure awareness, and the term fire here is an interesting term because what they're referring to is a dynamic and transformative process. When that process descends to the level of individuated being, though covered in Maya, though covered in ancestral trauma, Maya is turbulence which becomes structured and has boundaries, and that structure manifests in each of us because we are an emanation of a process that we could call family. We're a manifestation of the family system we're involved in. And that family system for each of us, interestingly, they say, involves 26,000 separate individuals. Can you imagine how complicated that can be? Holy moly. When I do little ancestral puja every morning. I do an ancestral puja every morning because I want to remind myself that I need to love my life. And I need to love, in order to grow, we have to love our lives. And loving our life, I read something funny yesterday. I have an old friend from Bloomington named David Eastman who was always skeptical of me, but with whom I have a long-term enduring relationship. I don't blame him for being skeptical. But David posts regularly on Facebook, and I think yesterday he posted something, a quote somebody said, "In order to be really happy, we have to forever abandon our hope for a better past." Isn't that brilliant? I just thought that was brilliant. All of us hope for a better past. How ridiculous. How we are ridiculous. A hope for a better past. I do this ancestral puja because as part of growing, we need to love our lives. And as part of loving our lives, we need to let go of our hope for a better past and love it however it was. Genuinely love it. And be grateful for it. And those of us who are here together, we absolutely have that opportunity to love our entire past for exactly as it was, because we are here. It brought us to this moment where we can embrace, where we can directly experience beauty. Directly. Here we are, we're wrapped in beauty in this place. And we're wrapped in love in this place. And all of whatever the limitations of the love that we experienced in our lives growing up, that limitation is over. Gone. We can love our lives, and our past. And I do that every morning. I spend a few minutes connecting to my body, feeling myself, feeling as deeply as I can into the cells in my body and the DNA, and connecting to the gratitude that I have for my direct ancestors and my distant ancestors, and to the whole of humanity, because, I am connected in all of that. And I genuinely love it. Genuinely. They're a bunch of fucking lunatics, but I love them. I love them. I'm grateful. My puja starts with my direct ancestors and goes to my distant ancestors, and then goes to the total environment in which all of my ancestors have emerged, and the energies and the beings and the powers that permeate that environment, and all the way up to, a direct and simple connection with the mind of God, which I am an emanation of. So, I want to continue here. That fire descends to that lowest level of my physical body and my immediate ancestors and my distant ancestors. That fire is beginning to dissolve the ancestral trauma which I inherited from all those crazy people. And I can see in myself and see in them, something wonderful, which has brought me to this moment, in spite of all the difficulty. that awareness elevates me beyond the pain and beyond the endless freight train of disappointment that life continually brings to really to all of us, but especially to people who are confused about why they're here. When the fire, the creative process, descends to the lower stages, though they are covered in Maya, it partly burns the fuel known as objects. Now, objects, the world around us, it partly burns, it partly consumes this descent of grace, partly consumes our experience of any other. That's because, ultimately, there is no other. Duh. And we begin to really, our perception of the objects, changes. And one of the ways, Abhinavagupta interestingly explores this, Abhinavagupta being the person upon whom this work is done by a disciple of Abhinavagupta's. Abhinavagupta explores the relationship between subject and object in its contracted fashion. In the context of the theater, Abhinavagupta he really, in Kashmir, there was not a great commitment to the plastic arts. There wasn't a lot of painting that happened there. There wasn't a lot of sculpture that happened there. There was some, and what there was could be extraordinary. Especially the sculpture was extraordinary. But Abhinavagupta's interest was in drama and poetry. And ultimately, his interest was in language, which is, and linguistics. But drama, the theater, was his metaphor for life. And the relationship between the actors on the stage and the context in which they were acting, which was the play, and the place that they were acting, that's the theater, and the audience, which is the ultimate subject, is explored by Abhinavagupta. And where he comes to in all of this is that in the context of appreciating theater or poetry or art in any form, there is a creative connection which causes us to suspend our judgment, like in theater. We go in knowing it's theater, and so we don't, any drama that's happening there, we don't take personally. And it doesn't, it might trigger us, like, you will notice that in some parts of some dramas on the television, I get agitated and I have to get up and walk around. I get agitated for two reasons. One is either it's boring me to tears and I'm so want to push the fast forward button that it makes me crazy because I know nobody else is into it. Lots of people don't like me doing that, so I blow a fuse and I have to get up and walk around. Or, I can't take the violence that's about to go down, and I get up and walk around from that. That's the way I do it. But most of the time, we realize in the context of theater that it's not a personal threat. And so suspending our sense of the threat, we can begin to appreciate the dynamic. And seeing the dynamic, we can develop a flow with that story. And developing a flow with that story, we can see underneath all stories a creative expression that has a specific flavor to it. And the flavor of that creative story leads us to an experience of a deeper creative flavor, which suggests to us and ultimately leads us to a direct experience of the inspiration that is divine beauty. Oh, this discussion of the descent of fire refers to what is called a term called Shaktipat. Should I go there yet? Did I cover, the experience of the dissolution, the partial dissolution of objects well enough so that you get that it is the descent of grace which loosens the structure of our trauma through the experience of beauty. The structure of our traumas is released enough that we can begin to understand that the objects that we see in our lives as absolutely differently separate from are nothing other than a part of our own ancestral trauma. And we begin to see how all of the things that we struggle with in our life are emanations of, we struggle with them because of the way we see them, and the way we see them is an emanation of our own ancestral trauma, and that we see it at all is because there's so much that we don't, there's so many things going on that we don't see all the time that could trigger us, but that doesn't trigger us because it's not a part of our particular subset of trauma. The radio frequency that we're operating on is a channel that, has its own set of movies. Released from these movies, we begin to experience the divine creative power, which is in the essence of all the movies. How amazing. And we don't get trapped so much. Slowly, sorry, it requires some patience. We see the objects differently. We see the objects as reflections of our own tensions that we can then let go of. And letting go of the flow in ourselves builds, and having the flow in ourself build, we rise above all the tensions and in my case, can live like I can live ever more fully in my delusional optimism and my, terminal naivete. And, maybe I don't know. And I said this last week, I don't know, we don't know. Maybe I'm being the fool on the hill, I'm happy, or the fiddler on the roof. I'm happy to be the fool on the hill or the fiddler on the roof. I am not going to be tricked into and then trapped by a whole bunch of feelings in my heart and thoughts in my head that cause me to melt into a puddle of poison. I'm not going to do that. I absolutely am not. I've been there, I've done that, it's shit. So, they say, spirituality leads to a form of divine madness. I'm happy to be a madman, like Rumi or Kabir. These are guys who were completely insane poets. Or Hafiz, another lunatic. I'm happy to be a crazy person. I am happy to be a drunkard, because I'm drunk on joy and drunk on beauty, and I don't give a shit what anybody says. But to have a life in which we are able to live in the total uncertainty, which is the very nature of human life, and to live it with joy, and to live it with love, to live it as kindness, and connection and creative expression and community, all of these things together, empowers us so strongly to release tension and allow creativity, our creativity, and the creativity that is intrinsic to the very space that we exist in, to be released and expressed is just an amazing thing. So, this descent of fire is called Shaktipat. And that Shaktipat burns up our ancestral trauma so that we begin to experience directly our connectedness with the objects that permeate our life. And we see very directly that we are not disconnected from those. We are not independent of, separate from, disconnected from any of those objects and any of the struggles that those objects might in some way be an expression of in our life. The fire of consciousness burns up the forms covering the lower states by its mere will, is one of the translations. But once the full power of consciousness has been attained, it assimilates everything. Or another way of saying it, and this is the 15th sutra, attaining this power, the inherent power of the divine vision, the truth that this entire world is nothing but the self. It's nothing but our own deepest, innermost self is realized. Further, it says, when the bliss of universal consciousness is attained, there is a stability of the consciousness of identity with Chit, even while in the body, is experienced. This state is called liberated, Jivan Mukti, liberated while one is alive. So, the bliss of universal consciousness, the beauty of, the joy, the recreative capacity that we refer to as love. That we experience as passion. Burns up all of the limited structures of that encapsulate our hearts and minds and, cause us to be frustrated with ourselves and afraid of the world and afraid of what is going to happen to us in these limited circumstances. It dissolves it all and makes accessible from within ourselves a creative power which manifests itself as in relationship to other people as kindness and love, a love that is expressed in cosmic time, not in human time, that transforms our whole vision of ourselves and allows us to see ourselves as flow and other as flow and our life as our place as flow and our life as flow, and everything becomes, our mind becomes settled in the awareness and in the profundity of contact, alignment, and flow. The experience of beauty is what Abhinavagupta is referring to as, in his observation of his metaphor of the theater. The connection between the drama and the observer, the subject and the object, dissolves the boundary and reveals the connection and the flow, and the extraordinary metaphor, of our own individual tensions and trauma, manifest in the play in front of us. Meaning how we experience the play is really not something based on what that's about, but rather based on what's going on in here. Slowly, slowly, our minds are turned within and settled in the experience of contact, alignment, and flow, whose deeper state is the experience of beauty and love, and that dissolves and dissolves and dissolves our misunderstanding about ourselves in relationship to the world. We are not separate, we are not struggling, we are not in any way, in fear of anything. Even while we're in the body, we are liberated by the experience of beauty. We are liberated to accept ourselves completely, and liberated to express ourselves fully, not in terms of our individual desires and our individual, hopes and fears, because those things don't exist anymore. We are liberated to express the love in our hearts to its last drop, in understanding that love is nothing other than the divine creative power, which is not something we have control over. It is something that we are an expression of, that we have the capacity to ever more fully enjoy. And that enjoyment frees us from the need to do anything or be anywhere, except in direct connection to, one way to put it is except in direct connection to God. So then the next sutra is, by the development of the center there is the acquisition of the bliss of Chit. The development of the center. And then the next statement goes on to say, the principal method of achieving this expansion, the development of the center, is 1, to stop the flow of thoughts, 2, to draw back the force of awareness as if it flows outward, 3, to cause the reversion of that force when it is already fully active, 4, to allow the energy to expand to its limits, 5, to contract and expand the vital energy in the upper kundalini and to do so in the lower kundalini as well, to cut the 2 flows of the breath by bringing them to rest in the heart through the sound ha and ka, and to focus awareness on the points at which the flow of the breath begins and ends. So here in the 18th Sutra, they are talking about spiritual practice. And they're giving us a set of practices which basically are called vikalpa kyasya, the dissolution of mental constructs. Mental constructs. I am this, you are that. Dissolved. Because I am ultimate creative energy. And there is no other. There is no other. Right? There's no other. So then Shakti Sankocha, the turning of awareness within and holding the energy within. Shakti Vikasa, holding the center while the energy expands outward. Shakti Sankosha Vikasa, expansion and contraction of the energy through restraint of the upper and lower Kundalini. We haven't talked about Kundalini yet. Vahacheda, cutting off the flows by bringing prana apana to a stillness through accessing Icha in the center. Adyanta Koti Nibbana, settling the mind by paying attention to the breath's points of emergence and the points of its coming to rest. Umesha Dasha Nisevana, bringing attention to the moment of unfolding, the initial arising of any energy state. Ramaniya Visaya Charvana, relishing the beauty of experience. Anandapurna Svatma Bhavana, meditating on oneself when full of bliss. These are the methods, basically. So, these express different styles of meditation. And because this physical body is a manifestation of the mind of Shiva and the union of Shiva and the goddess. You know, when you see in the Tibetan paintings, but also this notion of the union of Shiva and Shakti as an intimate physical union, as a union that generates bliss, as a sexual union. You know, when you see this, it is really referring to the practice of realizing the ultimate reality through the meditation on joy. Constraining our mind, pulling our attention within ourselves, holding ourselves in the awareness of our physical body and its processes. You know, this is grasping the center and becoming aware of the center for the purpose of breaking down, restraining the energy, which in respiratory process breaks down the structure, which facilitates its expansion. Now, isn't it interesting that just as an aside, it's interesting to me, and I'm sharing this with Jen and Gretchen and Laura, and people who do healing work, it's interesting that in constraining the fluctuation of the cerebral spinal fluid, which is the very foundation of an aid into the physical body, in constraining that so that it intensifies its circulation in some form, and it doesn't take much. You know, for us, it just takes putting your hand on a person or putting a needle in a place, or, you know, there are lots of different ways to do it, but constraining that fluctuation intensifies its motion against the structure of tension or strain or trauma, and that intensification of the circulation dissolves the structure and releases the structure as a constraint, and the energy and facilitates the energy expansion, which then allows for the expression of the innate nature of the ultimate reality in the physical world. And what is that? When divine creative energy is released and expressed in the physical world, what is that called? Well, it's called health, actually. It's called health. When we have released ancestral trauma and its accumulated tension, it manifests as health. And hallelujah. Our bodies become balanced, and there is the harmony of rhythmic, balanced interchange, which is another term for respiratory process. Respiratory process in the body is the lower kundalini. The respiratory process of the mind is the upper kundalini. Now, what is the respiratory process of the mind? Our perception extending itself, collecting information, and bringing itself back. You know, and there's a metaphor in Shaivism and in the poetry of Shaivism especially that talks about bees, the hive, the flowers, the pollen, and the honey. And so when properly understood, the whole process of perception is the process of extending our awareness into our environment, appreciating the small sources of beauty, collecting them all together, bringing them back inside us, you know, and taking all of that process and all of its tensions and all of its challenges and bringing it into ourselves and refining it into the honey that is the bliss of the experience of beauty. So the constraint of the lower kundalini is actually pranayama and asana and pranayama. The constraint of the upper kundalini is meditation. When we constrain our senses from this respiratory process that is extending into the field and pulling it back, which happens 12 times a minute. On our breath. And we pull it back we constrain that, the whole structure of our mind changes. And in having the structure of our mind change, the structure of the VR set through which we view the world is changed, and we see the world and ourselves slowly, 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 a little more clearly. And we experience the base of ourselves, which is the beauty of the creative energy of life itself, beauty of the union of Shiva and Shakti. We experience that more completely, and that joy becomes the basis of our existence. And having that joy as the basis of our existence, everything we see and touch and every word that we speak becomes, an expression of love, an expression of joy, an expression of beauty that accumulates in the field as a resonance which, uplifts us and everything that comes into contact with us. So, Kundalini is a term we haven't discussed. What time is it? Okay, we're going to stop now. And I'm going to stop talking, and maybe I'll try to do one more and focus on the term Kundalini because it's important. But do you have a question? Anybody have a question? I'll respond for a minute. Okay. Go ahead, Suze.
So it seems that it's really our perception of pain
pain and pleasure are totally close, very close, and it's really just energy that is traveling through a slightly different neural pathway. And so there is a discussion, particularly in Dzogchen, but I would like to say that my own personal opinion after years of study is that the source of Dzogchen, which is a Tibetan tradition that is called, that means something like the perfection of meditative practice, in Dzogchen particularly, but also in its source, which I think is the Krama of Shakta Shaivism, there is this idea that of equal taste, which means pain and pleasure are one, not different. And that doesn't refer to, the fact that we've numbed ourselves up enough that, we get confused about what's painful and what's not. It refers to the fact that we have taken in we have internalized, brought into ourselves our entire world over and over and over again until we have seen through the pain and the pleasure to a point where the flavor of it is one. That takes some practice, because all of our pain, we don't like it, and everybody responds to that kind of stimulus differently, but, it tends to accentuate our sense that the world is comprised of two things that give us pleasure and things that give us pain. And seeing through that, we see an ever more increasingly big and refined view of the world in which all of the objects of it, whether they cause pleasure or pain, are really one simple creative energy. So there is that notion that, it's all a single flavor, is really the notion of jivan in the term here, which is not it's a Hindu term, jivan mukti, liberated while living, liberated in the context of a dualistic framework, that state is a state in which the single flavor, the bliss that is the very nature of divine consciousness, is what we're living in connection with all the time. And to sit in meditation, let's say to do asana practice and pranayama, and to sit in meditation to constrain the outward flow of the energy, is a conservation of our resource, which then facilitates, the release of trauma, tension and trauma, and the emergence of a flow in our physical bodies and a flow in our energetic bodies and a flow in our relationship to the totality of life itself that transforms us completely into somebody who's delusionally optimistic and terminally naive. We become mad people, especially in the context of the madness that is this world today. We're mad. And it's a mad that is, we're drunkards, drunk on beauty, drunk on joy, drunk on, the appreciation of this moment and the appreciation of the possibility that we live in. Overwhelmed with gratitude So, okay, I'm going to stop now, and I'll try to do better next week. You know, and happy to be with you guys.